Nothing bad happened to you. That's what makes it so confusing. There was no single event, no obvious wound, no moment you can point to and say, that's where it went wrong. Your parents were present. They fed you, clothed you, kept you safe. And yet, something was consistently missing. Not love exactly, not care exactly. Something harder to name. The experience of being truly seen, of having your inner world met with curiosity instead of dismissal, of learning that your feelings were real and valid and worth attending to. That absence, quiet, invisible, accumulating over years, is called emotional neglect, and its effects are some of the most pervasive and least recognized in psychology. Psychologist Jonice Webb, who has done more to name and describe childhood emotional neglect than almost any other researcher, defines it not as something that happened, but as something that failed to happen. The response that didn't come when it should have, the curiosity that wasn't shown, the feelings that weren't asked about, the inner world that was never reflected back. Emotional neglect is defined by absence, which is precisely what makes it so difficult to identify. You can't point to the wound, because the wound isn't something that was done. It is something that was never done. And the absence of a thing leaves no scar, just a space where something should have been. Here's the most fundamental effect, and the most surprising. People who experienced emotional neglect in childhood often have significant difficulty identifying their own emotions, not because they don't feel things, but because nobody ever helped them develop the language and the framework for their own inner experience. Psychologists call this alexithymia, difficulty identifying and describing one's own emotional states. And research consistently shows it appears at significantly higher rates in people who experienced emotional neglect. When a child says, "I feel something," and the adults around them respond with dismissal, distraction, or silence, the child learns that the feeling either isn't real or isn't important enough to name. Over time, the ability to notice, name, and navigate emotions, a skill that has to be learned, modeled, and reflected, never fully develops. The adult who experienced emotional neglect often knows something is wrong, but cannot say what. They feel a vague sense of emptiness, flatness, or low-level distress, and no clear idea of where it comes from or what to do with it. The feelings are there. The map to them was never provided. Here's the effect that is hardest to articulate, and most often mistaken for depression, personality, or ingratitude. Many adults who experienced emotional neglect describe a persistent, low-level feeling of emptiness, not sadness, not quite loneliness, something more like a hollow space where a sense of self should be. Jonice Webb's research identifies this as one of the most consistent markers of childhood emotional neglect in adults, a felt sense of being somehow less than, somehow incomplete, somehow not quite real. This isn't a mood disorder. It is the predictable result of a developmental gap. When a child's emotional experience is consistently not reflected back to them, when nobody mirrors their inner world, names their feelings, or shows genuine curiosity about what they experience, the child's sense of self develops without a foundation. The self that forms is capable, functional, often highly competent, but it is built on sand rather than stone. And the adult who moves through the world on this foundation often cannot explain why nothing feels like enough, why achievements don't satisfy, why connections feel thin, why there is always this quiet sense that something essential is missing. Because something essential was. Here's the behavioral effect that most people externalize. They see it in their relationships, not their childhood. Adults who experienced emotional neglect are significantly more likely to become caretakers in their relationships, attentive to others' needs, skilled at reading emotional states, responsive and present for everyone around them, and simultaneously, almost completely unable to identify or ask for their own needs. This is not a coincidence. The child who grew up in a household where emotional needs were ignored learned one of two things: either that needs don't matter, or that the way to have any connection is to focus entirely on others. Both conclusions produce the same adult, someone who gives freely and receives poorly, who can see clearly when someone else is struggling, and goes completely blind to their own distress, who finds asking for help almost physically uncomfortable, not because they're too proud, but because they genuinely haven't developed the internal awareness that they need something. Psychologist Jonice Webb calls this the fundamental neglect legacy, an inward turn blindness that is the direct consequence of never having had one's own inner world attended to. Here's the layer that makes it most painful. Adults who experienced emotional neglect often don't just fail to recognize their needs. They feel guilty when they do. A specific, uncomfortable guilt, as if wanting things is selfish, as if needing support is a burden, as if feeling bad is something to apologize for. This guilt has a logical origin. In a household where the adults were emotionally unavailable, whether through their own unresolved pain, depression, stress, or simply a different emotional language, the child who expressed needs made things harder. The tears that went unanswered long enough taught the child, "My emotions are a problem." The needs that were met with irritation or silence taught them, "Wanting things makes me difficult." The child internalized this not as a rule, but as a truth about themselves, and the adult carries it as a felt sense. "I should not need. I should not feel. My inner experience is an inconvenience to others." Every time they reach for support, even from people who genuinely want to give it, this old truth activates, and the hand pulls back. So here is the picture of childhood emotional neglect in adulthood, a difficulty knowing what you feel because the emotional language was never taught, a persistent emptiness where a sense of self should be because the inner world was never reflected, a pattern of caring for others while being blind to yourself because your needs were never the priority, and a guilt around having needs at all because needing was learned as a problem rather than a given. None of these are character flaws. None of these are what you chose. Every single one is the predictable, documented consequence of growing up in an environment where the emotional dimension of childhood was simply not attended to. The wound of emotional neglect is invisible, but it is real, and it is treatable. Here's what makes emotional neglect uniquely difficult to address. Because nothing obviously bad happened, because there is no event to point to, no villain to name. People who experienced it often don't believe they're allowed to have been affected by it. They compare themselves to people with real trauma and conclude that their experience doesn't qualify, but the nervous system doesn't grade on a curve. The absence of what was needed is registered just as deeply as the presence of what was harmful. The child who was never seen is not less affected than the child who was hurt. They are differently affected, and the path forward, which exists, and which many people have taken, begins with the same thing it always begins with: naming it. Not as an accusation, not as a verdict on your parents, as a description accurate and compassionate of something that was missing and beginning, perhaps for the first time, to provide for yourself what was never provided for you. If this video described something you recognize in your history, in your patterns, in the quiet spaces you haven't known how to name, share it and subscribe, because every week we go deeper into the behaviors, the patterns, the things about being human that nobody explains.